Welcome to the Agile Wire, where professional Scrum trainers Jeff Boobles and Jeff Molesky discuss Agile topics. Now, here are your hosts, Jeff Boobles and Jeff Molesky.
And we're recording. All right, Mr. Boobles, kick us off, man.
All right, so this week on the podcast, we've got Colleen Johnson. Colleen is the CEO of Prokanban.org and then the CEO of ScatterSpoke, which is a online retro tool. So busy person, right? Like you got a lot going on. Family, you got 2 CEO jobs. How do you do it all, Colleen? Like what's the secret?
Yeah, I'm actually transitioning out of my CEO role at ScatterSpoke so I can focus full time on Prokanban, which has been a little hard for me to let go of it. I mean, my husband and I started ScatterSpoke together, so it's kind of our 4th child. But at least it makes it so like I can still backseat drive him as a CEO, which I'm sure he would hate to hear me say out loud. But our dinner table conversations are probably pretty mind-numbing for most people when we're talking about product roadmaps and Jira integrations, and so it's still all in the family. But he'll be taking over as CEO.
That's great. How did you start this company with your husband? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, it was kind of a funny thing. It was a long time ago. It was 2015 when we first launched the brand of ScatterSpoke and the site. He was interested in learning. He's a developer. He was interested in learning some new technology. I was doing a lot of coaching at the time through like lean startup style experiments of how can we test something small and get feedback. And I was like, every Friday rolls around and we're supposed to be doing a retro, half the team is out or doesn't come back from lunch on time, and we never get through these retros. What if you built me a quick retro board, right? And I was doing consulting work at the time, so I was able to take the board with me and test it out with a lot of my clients and get feedback. And that's all it was just a virtual retro board, nothing too exciting. We played around with it and would use it from time to time, but we never had a login system set up for it. And so, at one point we were like, maybe we should have people create an account. And so we just did that and then let it sit for a couple more months. And all of a sudden we went and checked our Google Analytics and we had like 30,000 people registered with accounts. And we were like, oh my God, people are using this. Like there's a need. We found some kind of a need for this that's real and tangible. And then again, life, kids, family, real jobs, the jobs that pay the bills came back into play. And we spend some time playing with it, put it on the back burner, spend some time playing with it. And then in 2019, we applied for Tiny Seed, which is a bootstrapped accelerator program. Fun fact, we were also in the accelerator program with the founders of Squadcast, which is the tool we're using to record today. So I was really excited to see that name pop up. And we got into that program and got some capital, first of all, that allowed us to go full-time focusing on the tool itself, and then really started to invest a lot more in all the things that we don't know how to do ourselves, right? Marketing, we had a marketing team, sales help, hired more developers, hired designers. And that's really when the tool became what you see there today. It's a crowded space these days. At the beginning of COVID, when COVID first happened, we were like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a total unicorn product now with everybody being remote. And at the beginning, it felt that way. Fast forward probably 6 months in, and every big tool vendor built a retrospective tool. So the space got crowded. We were losing customers, and we kind of had to pivot to something different to make our tool more unique. And we went down this path of building all of this data around how your team is performing that just sits on top of your retro data and tells you things like sentiment and common patterns and themes of the language that your team is using. So maybe is it more about people or tools or process? And that's really been our big differentiator that's gotten us back into the game again and really starting to work with a lot of big, well-known enterprise clients. So it's really fun sitting on this side of product development. I've always been on that, in the development side of the house. And it's hard when it's your own baby. It's easy to see how it's hard to stay focused on small batches and small deliverables. I mean, that's probably our biggest pain point on the product side, is we make these giant releases and then we can't deploy them in small batches to get feedback. And all the feedback I would coach other teams to do is really hard to do ourselves.
So you, Colleen, I'm really interested in something you were talking about in there, and you did a little bit of, this was what we pivoted to, some of the machine learning or the identifying the language that your team uses, bucket them. But if we can go back to that, where you all of a sudden, oh shit, this space is getting really crowded. We've got a lot of competitors out there. How do we reposition our product? Like, can you elaborate just a little bit on that in between, right? So the point at which you realize there's a threat and opportunities out there, how did you strategically pick which one you wanted to go after?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it was, and this probably ties nicely to some Kanban background, right? But I've always been a big proponent of pulling data into your retro and having some information to look at. And even if you separate out that practice from using a tool, I think one of the things we do that is just kind of a lost opportunity. If we were in person, right, we'd have these great retros, pull all these stickies down, maybe type up some notes in Confluence, and then in 2 weeks we do the whole thing over again. Like the last one never really happened. We might pull in new action items, but there's a greater story to tell there when you back up and look at maybe 3 months or 6 months worth of retro data to say, we've had the same conversation about our deployment pipeline for the last 3 months. Like that should be our number one priority, even if we're not identifying it. Or how do we elevate that to leadership? So I think it's always been a spot that I was really passionate about. But when we started to feel like that space got noisy, it was like, well, what could we do? Well, we have all these people using the tool. There's all this data in there. Really, we just had to bring it to the forefront with, like you said, with some machine learning tools and make it visible to folks. I think the other thing we did that we found, and this was straight from user feedback, was that people, there's always this question of how do I show value in retros and that we're having the right conversations to leaders without bringing them into a retrospective. So we have the concept of like a watcher on these team pulse reports so that you can share them with leadership and they can see trends and sentiment analysis, but they can't see any of the actual card text. And that's been something we found a lot of success with too. And that wouldn't have come from me as a Scrum Master. That came from my husband as being on the engineering leadership side of things, of feeling like retros are kind of this black hole of really valuable information about how your teams are working and how do you understand what's happening there in a way where you can take action, but not where you're breaking the trust of the team by trying to creep too much on what they're saying. So it was kind of a little bit of I think, both of our perspectives coming together there.
Quick break. We know you can't support all shows, but when you do support a show, think of the Agile Wire when you subscribe and share. Awesome. So I'll jump in here really quick because I always give Jeff a second because he'll jump right in with new questions. But so you just talked about retrospectives, and there's no, at least to my knowledge, there's no retrospective in Kanban. So why bother? Like, how'd you get to that point?
I think there is a retrospective in Kanban. Well, so this is a great debate, right? I've done a lot of speaking around this topic because a lot of what you're trying to do from a Kanban perspective is use the data about how your team is performing to make small improvements to how you're working, right? So it's constant fine tuning that's never really complete. And at its core, that kind of is a retrospective, right? But I think what's missing from the way we might think of a traditional retrospective is that data evaluation. It probably sounds daunting if you've never gotten into the weeds with flow metrics, but it doesn't have to be super difficult to get started. You can start with some pretty simple metrics that you probably already have available about how your team is working and just start to pull those into your retro. And so I think maybe the language retrospective isn't super common in the Kanban community. And maybe the concept of doing a data review might not be super common from the Scrum side of things, but both practices are there. It's just kind of, I think, shoring up the language together. I would say the other thing, there's no requirement around a cadence from a Kanban perspective of doing a retro every 2 weeks. So they tend to be either event driven around a release, right? Or you stick with some kind of, I tend to work with a lot of companies that are doing some mix of Scrum and Kanban across all of their engineering teams. So we tend to stick with 2 weeks anyway, because that's what the Scrum teams are on. But yeah, there's absolutely a great opportunity to do retros in Kanban.
Yeah, I would say nothing's required. There's not a lot that's truly required in Kanban, right? But continuous improvement and making better decisions is basically what Kanban's all about, making better decisions sooner, right? So I look at it as like, well, you could do that in retro or you could do it another way, but let's figure out a way to do that. And I think marrying, like you said, the data and then like the people side of things together, because Scrum's so focused usually on the people side without the data, and Kanban tends to go way on the data side and sometimes forget a little bit about the people. So what's that right balance? How do we pull that in? I think a combination too of like polling retros and then also like time boxes, because there's some teams where maybe they just feel a lot of pressure for whatever reason, and they'll forget the retro, or they'll say we don't have time for that. And then they don't understand what that does to the impact of their metrics because they think they're working harder, but they're actually and they should be getting more done, but they're actually getting less done because of something we could see in the data,
Yep.
And some insights we could provide if we just would sit down and talk about it from a big picture standpoint.
Well,
so yeah, I think
I like to try to look at those too as like that experiment cycle, right? Of if you want your teams to get engaged in fine tuning their process, I think the best thing you can do is give them a lot of latitude to make changes. I try not to change anything major every 2 weeks. If that's the cycle we're on, it might take, depending on a team's cycle time, it might take 4 to 6 weeks to see the impact of those changes. But I probably let a lot of the teams I work with change too much, because I want them to get comfortable telling me we should have 10 items per person for our work in progress. And it's like, well, I don't know that I would agree with that, but I would love for you to try it for a couple of weeks so I can show you the downside of pulling in that much work per person, right? And so it's as long as you have the latitude in an organization to let them try a little and fail, I think connecting that like fine tuning to reviewing the data to understand the impact really gets people bought into the process itself.
I'll give you another product idea here for something that could be a differentiator. Like if you could incorporate that with flow metrics, like WIP, work item age, cycle time, and throughput, and then say, these are the trends we're seeing, and here's what's happening to your data. Wow, that would be magical right there. I can tell you that.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping to. We're starting with Jira, but we're also hoping to do some with actionable Agile too, where it will pull in all of that at the beginning of your retro to kick off with kind of your sprint metrics or your last retro. How are all these numbers looking? I love that idea too. It's exciting.
All right, so let's pivot a little bit. Let's talk about Prokanban. So, what's Prokanban, Colleen? Why should people care about it?
Why should people care? Well, Prokanban is first and foremost a learning community. Everyone is welcome, and our mantra here is don't be a jerk, be excellent to everyone, a la Bill and Ted. But our goal here is to really just make a safe learning space. I think can be really hard stepping into new environments as the newbie, new learner, or you're curious and you want to try to find out more. And I think historically Kanban has been a hard place to step in and do that as a new person. And, you mentioned the data side of things. I think that can add to some of the fear there of trying to understand these metrics and how to use them and where to get started. And so we just really wanted to create a safe learning environment for anybody that, whether you've been doing this as long as Dan Vicanti or you're brand new at this, where can you start to connect and learn, and then really create an opportunity for those that are interested to mentor and help other people on that journey. I think probably one of the coolest things that I've seen so far and that I'm really excited about, and I think this comes from really mirroring a lot of what we're doing to what Scrum.org has done in the past, is that we're also trying to make the organization itself a learning opportunity, right? Things are going to change. And the Scrum Guide does a great job of evolving with the industry. We want to be able to do that same thing. We might look back and say, we should call this a Kanban retrospective. Let's put that in the Scrum Guide. But it's also, I think, acknowledging a little bit that what we know now might be different from what we know in 2 years, and we want to be able to evolve with that.
That's great. So tell me more. How do we make it safe? Like, what are some of the things that differentiate it from other learning communities that are out there? Because I think probably all of them would say we try to make it safe, but maybe some do a better job of living that than others.
Yeah, I'm learning firsthand that this is easy to say and hard to do. It really is. It requires some conversations I wish I didn't have to have with folks when things kind of go off the rails. I think a lot of times this gets amplified in a global community like this because there's just language differences and communication differences across different geographic places, right? And so there's some of that comes up sometimes where we have to get people together to have a conversation who may be butting heads, and it's not that either of them are trying to be jerks. It's just it's a communication thing. And then in some cases, it's asking people to leave the community. We haven't had to do that much, but we have had to do it. And I think, part of it is being able to say, this is what we expect out of everyone participating here. And if you can't get on board with that, we will ask that you step out.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. I mean, culture is what you tolerate, right? I don't know who originally said that, but that's a fair I don't know, look at culture as like, if you're tolerating poor behavior, then that's what it's going to become for everyone. So, yeah, that's what you have to do at times.
Well, and I think it's important too, that poor behavior doesn't mean that we disagree about how to run a retro or we disagree about how to best use flow metrics. Like, we have to welcome that disagreement around those types of things, because that's how we learn. That's how we're all going to learn. So a little bit of that is like, how do we welcome disagreement, but do it in a respectful way? To me, when somebody gets asked to leave, it's that lack of respect for each other. It's not a difference of, what you believe Kanban to be used for, or how you're going to apply flow metrics, right? It's how you're treating each other.
Mm-hmm.
So along the same lines, I was going to ask, and Jeff almost stole the question out of my head, but who are kind of the big players in the Kanban space? And so, like, thinking about the Scrum space, right? Scrum Alliance, Scrum Inc., Scrum.org, probably many others that aren't coming to mind. But who are the big players in the Kanban space? And then what do you see as your differentiator from them? And I think you maybe hit on it just a little bit there, but if you wouldn't mind expanding on it a little bit more.
Well, I would say a lot of our content here is really built off of the brain of Dan Vacanti, who wrote When Will It Be Done? And Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability. So there's a slight differentiator just in having, him at the helm of creating a lot of our content, because it's starting with data, right? It's all started with a lot of data and how to use data you probably already have on your team to start to improve the way you're working. We've had help from Ryan Ripley and Todd Miller on building our course content. Jose Casal, Jean-Paul, I'm gonna forget people now. John Coleman. We've had a
lot of familiar names you're throwing out there.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, it's a strong community, and it's been really great because it's almost everyone I just rattled off also is doing consulting work or doing other things, right? Where you get busy and somebody else needs to be able to jump in and help. And I think that's been pretty impressive too, of like kind of passing the baton sometimes to say, I need help with, building up metrics courses or whatever the case may be. But I would say one of the other big differentiators, and Jeff, you mentioned this too, is that we're trying to start really simple, right? I think that it can feel daunting when there's, all these things layered on top that maybe you just don't need to get started. And so we've tried to really strip a lot of that away. So it's very simple. And like you said, there's not a lot of rules. So, there's, I think, all these misconceptions of like, you can't do story pointing in Kanban, and you can't have a retro in Kanban. You can't have a Scrum Master on a Kanban team. And it's like, if those things help your team deliver or help you guys break down work and have a great conversation about what you're trying to deliver, then keep it. Why would you get rid of it? It's probably one of the things I see the most too with teams I coach of they're switching from Scrum to Kanban, and they get rid of all of their upfront planning meetings. Like, we're not going to story point. We don't need grooming. We don't need a planning meeting. And then every story they pull in gets stuck because nobody really understands what it is, or it's too big, or it needs more conversation about the acceptance criteria. And it's like a lot of those practices and conversations exist for a reason, and it doesn't have to be this like Scrum versus Kanban approach to things. If they're working for you, keep them.
So there's two courses right now at Prokanban. What are the big differences between these two courses and that are out there?
Yeah, the two courses are Applying Professional Kanban, which is our first course. And then we just launched a new course last month called Applying Metrics for Predictability, or AMP. Both of them have a assessment exam that you can take with them to get certified. And they're not easy. They're both pretty tricky. I didn't pass either of them on my first take. I always like to tell everyone that because I think
that's some honesty right there. I like that.
I don't want. I'll save my scores for later. But it took me multiple times to pass each one. Applying Professional Kanban is really about how to get started. So what are the things that you would want to do? How would you take the work you currently have and start to look at breaking that down into a workflow that you could visualize and start to create some signals for your team around when to take specific actions? So we play games, we look at metrics, we dive right into metrics in the first course. And then in the second one, the Applying Metrics for Predictability, it's a really deep dive into how to use flow metrics for forecasting. So we talk about forecasting single items, like when will a story be done? And we've talked about forecasting items with a lot of things in it, which can be an epic or a feature or an initiative, right? It doesn't really matter what that container is, but it has lots of something in it. So we look at forecasting in a couple different ways. It's a little mind melting, like it's a lot of math, but it's also pretty incredible when you get in there and play around with it. I think for all, there's a lot of teams I've worked with where I've tried to help them understand Monte Carlos and how we're using this data to forecast. And I've probably fumbled through explaining it and relied a little too heavily on maybe a tool to show them like, well, here's the pretty output. Here's your calendar with the red, green, and yellow. Mm-hmm. And this course really helps you explain what is happening in that Monte Carlo on the back end to a team so that you can break it down and tell them, here's the differences of what we're doing. And here's how you as a team could impact the output of these numbers. That's probably my favorite part. I'm working with a team right now This is probably a familiar story for everybody. They had a date. I think their original milestone to deploy this big version of their mobile app was supposed to be the end of September. And they missed that one. And each week, the product owner has been going to stand up and said, every time she goes to stand up, there's 5 or 6 new stories that have just popped into the board, not even into the backlog, but are all of a sudden in progress because the developers keep finding more things that have to be done for this release. So there's probably a lot to break down there from a process perspective of root cause of what's going on, of why the work's popping up. But every time we look at the numbers, right, the date's moving around. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we help the team understand, if they've been trying to hit the end of October as their date. But like everybody, at least on the US side of things, as we start pushing towards the US Thanksgiving holiday and Christmas here, everything slows way down. It's going to be a lot harder to get something out the door. So we were like, how do we motivate these guys to understand the impact of pulling all this work in kind of randomly? We just started putting the Monte Carlo in front of them. So at every stand-up now, we're like, here's the number of stories in the backlog and in progress. This is today forecasting that you'll be done, between November 8th and 10th with 85% likelihood, right? So we're doing that every single morning. And the number's moving, but it was like 2 weeks ago, it was moving in like 2-week increments. Today from Friday, it moved by 1 day. So I think it is getting that data in front of a team, I think really helps them understand the impacts of some of the actions that they're taking. And it's a lot easier to coach in my mind with those numbers than just trying to convince them, just trying to tell them, right?
Yeah, I think you hit on something pretty important there. There's a lot of times I'm working with a group of people. They come to a class, maybe it's public, maybe it's private. And I show them Monte Carlo and say, look, this is how this thing works. This is why it's different than Monte Carlos you've used in the past, where we took a bunch of guesses and we then did all these simulations and then we'd made some forecasts out of it. This is what we've done in the past. This is where things this is using empirical data. Like, this is why this is different. And you go through this whole thing and it's showing it and they say, this is great, but maybe not having having a dedicated set of time to talk about this. Like usually it's, 15 minutes, maybe a half hour if you're lucky to spend on that. And a class that's a much broader subject area. And having like a class, or a workshop where you're actually going to go ahead and go through a bunch of examples and simulations and figuring this stuff out and why they care and how do they really do this and kind of walk through it a number of times. I think that'll then help them apply it more. Because I think a lot of times people see it, and like you said, they think it's a really pretty picture and it looks cool and I like that, but I'm not confident enough then to go give that same forecast to somebody else, one of my leaders in my organization, because I don't quite understand it completely. Right. Maybe I'm not 100% bought in on it. And that's probably one of the things that make this course so different, right? I don't know of any other Agile metrics courses like this that are out there. Do you?
I don't know of any others either. Yeah, I think this is kind of the first of its kind. And what's fun about it is we ask all the students in the course to bring their data, right? If whatever tool you're using, like export all this stuff out of Jira and bring it to class, and we'll forecast using your team's data, which I think, like you said, also helps it really sink in because you start to see it. And you see that you can start with it right away. This isn't, I think that's another thing you hear a lot when we talk about flow metrics is like, you have to start all over. We have to start over with new team data or new information or a new project, clean data. So it's like, how do you show a team that you've probably got enough data points for this already? We can use data that already exists and start from there.
How long are these courses?
We don't stick with a specific delivery format for these. I would say each course is about 2 days worth of content, but you'll see it taught in different variations of that.
Sure.
So some people like to teach 2 days. We have a handful of trainers that break it up over 4 3-hour sessions. So it kind of varies. We've got some that do over 3 days over the weekend. So we've tried to offer it in a lot of different ways so that you can find the class format that's going to fit best for your schedule.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was just thinking about like my brain and the state of mush that it would probably be in after like 2 straight days of analyzing data. Like, I mean that with joy in my heart. Like that would be a great experience to be able to really dive that deep into things and really understand and get it. But also at the same time, like I'd be pretty useless at the end of those 2 days if I needed to concentrate on something.
Yeah, I was taking it with Dan Vicanti and Julia. And we were starting, because they were both in European time, we were starting at 6 a.m. And I was like, oof, I don't know how much I can do with this right now. But I felt like a puddle by the time noon rolled around my time, because it is a lot. It's a lot to take in, but it is really cool. And it's fun to figure out ways to apply it, for your teams right away.
There was something else inside of that story that you were talking about, like the product owners showing up, and all of a sudden there's 5 new stories that are popping up on the backlog. And it may be like literally just today I was going through this exercise with the team, and it's one of my favorite exercises. I stole it. It used to be in the professional Scrum product owner course, but they got rid of it at some point. Anyway, it was around thin slicing, and I know like lots of people have their techniques for how to do it. I just really enjoyed this one and going through it with the team. Essentially, you make a list of all the stuff that you do to get ready in the morning, and then you have them put it on a board, and then you have them thematically group it. So you basically come up with a workflow, or your journey mapping, right? Putting flesh on the bones, or whatever that phrase is. And then you say, all right, oops, your alarm clock didn't go off this morning, and you only got 7 minutes to get ready. And man, I'm going to get in trouble for this comment, but there needs to be females in the group, because if there's not, and it's just guys, they're like, that's 5 minutes more than I need. All right. I'm just throwing some t-shirts on and I'm out the door. Right. But anyway, really getting the team to think about the point at which value is realized, right? If your goal is to get in the car, like you've got to do a certain amount of everything in that journey through your morning get ready routine. And it does you no good to do all the things in the bedroom that you need to get done, or all the things in the bathroom, if you don't get to your car in the amount of time that you have. And so it really forces you to think about what is that thin slice, and where is value realized in your chain, in your journey inside of there, and then start layering on more and more on top of it. And the situation that you just talked through is immediately what came to mind for me. Is I think a lot of teams skip that brainstorming, that kind of holistic view of the end to end of all the, and I'm not saying like pages and pages of documentation, but let's just think holistically about the steps that get us to this point. What is the minimum that we can get away with, right? Just lazy bag this stuff and get it in front of a customer so that we can actually learn what is really important. And then it's okay for these additional user stories or product backlog items to pop up, because we've already gotten to the point of value and validation in this feedback loop. So I know not directly related to Kanban, but I feel like that is another common pitfall that we fall into, where all of a sudden all this unknown scope just keeps popping up on our backlog. Well, it's because we didn't start here.
Well, I would say it is part of Kanban, because what's actually happening...
Oh, okay, fantastic. Hey,
what's actually happening is you have hidden WIP inside your system and you don't know it. And so because you have hidden WIP, your work item age is longer and your cycle times are lower and your throughput's lower. So you don't know it because you're not making it transparent, but it is part of Kanban. It is all full metrics, right? I don't know. What do you think, Colleen?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple ways to think about it too. We actually did pilot. Did you do that, Jeff? The work slicing pilot? We piloted.
I did not do that one, but I heard about. I mean, I've read about it and heard.
I thought maybe you were teeing that up for me, but we did pilot a work slicing class that Pratik taught, and it was awesome because it talked a lot about what you just said about how it's not just like story slicing, right? It's epic feature slicing, epic slicing. Like the bigger those things get, that's all a tangled web you're creating that makes it harder to switch gears, to learn to like cut the cord a little bit and move on to the next thing. So how do you look at making really small independent slices of value at all of those different levels of your work hierarchy? So one of the things that, and it's actually in the AMP class too, but when we're starting to interpret charts and look at things like cycle time scatter plots, one of the patterns that's kind of funny to see is when you see a bunch of dots in a row. So that's telling us all these things finished on the same day, and they kind of go vertically. Like this one took 1 day longer than the last one. That one took 1 day longer than so it's like all of them finished on the same day, but increased their cycle time by a day or two. That often means that all of those stories were dependent on each other. So I think one of the things that's really important when we think about how to slice things like that is how do we get them independent first and then focus on small, right? Because I think if you make them too small, you create dependencies, which really break your Kanban flow, because you have to let them all pile up to be tested or let them all pile up to be deployed, right? And then you see those lines where you get those little blips of like all 5 of these finished together. So you'll see a lot in the Kanban guide as well, where we really try to focus on get it as small as possible, but don't break the independent value of what you're working on to make it too small, because it breaks that flow up.
Yeah, the other one, you made me chuckle because I distinctly remember the story, but like I did that with a team, and lo and behold, that day where all the PBIs were crashing into done was the day before sprint review. You're like, oh, okay, so all this shit's really just sitting around, and it's not until the day before when people realize, oh, I need to go in and update it, set it to done, etc.
Yeah, it's cool. It doesn't matter if a team's using Scrum or Kanban. Those flow metrics are so powerful to review, and I try to get, at least at a high level, a couple of them into every sprint review or retro, so that we're looking at some of those kind of patterns. Even the cumulative flow diagram, which you can pull out of Jira, there's a lot of insight you can get just out of that visual, right? Like I always tell the team, where do you see piles? Like the one thing you don't want here is piles. So anytime you see those like bubbles in the color of your CFD, that's something piling up in your workflow. And same kind of concept, right? Why is it piling up and then all clearing out on the same day? So there's a lot we can learn from starting to put those in front of our teams, regardless of which methods we're using to deliver.
I like to look at the arrival and departure rates in that same, use this for the same idea, right? Like more stuff's coming in than's going out. We have more WIP going up. Our cycle time, what's going to happen, guys, to our cycle time and to our throughput? It's going to go down. So we can see this. What are we doing about it?
Yeah.
And so I always like looking at those ones too. So there's once you get into full metrics, it's just like, oh, you can't talk enough about how much they impact the way you work. Yeah. And you see it in everything you do too. I mean, I don't know. If Daniel and Pratik were here, they would say, just open a bunch of whiskey bottles and see how long it takes you to finish all of them. It's going to be a lot longer than if you just open one at a time, right? Like, those types of things. So you see it in, you can't not see it once you start seeing some of this stuff.
Yeah, when I talk a lot about WIP and flow, I like to use the airport as an example because it's such it's a very concrete capacity, right? So like you were talking about arrivals and departures, and I always start off by saying, if you've ever flown somewhere and landed and they said, we're going to have to sit on the runway for 45 minutes and wait for a gate, it's because your arrivals are outstripping your departures and there's no gates to pull up. And your team is that airport, right? No matter how much coffee you consume, there's still only a set number of gates. So I think there are a ton of examples, and it's fun to try to think about how does the airport measure, the time that's, is that a cost of delay then for the time that the planes sit there with no gate to pull up to? There's probably a lot of fun studies you could do there.
I think just another one that I've recently had a conversation with a prior colleague about this was, and this is so common, everybody jokes around about it, but like going into a client and looking at their backlog that's hundreds of items in size, right? And using that analogy that you just said, like, yeah, there's the WIP limit of what the team is working on right now, but there's also just the WIP limit of how much shit do we allow to accumulate in our backlog, right? And just really simply looking at, all right, over a set time period, how many things come into my backlog and how many things leave my backlog. Even that is a powerful conversation. Like for product owners, product managers, whoever's in charge of that list of work, understanding what's your capacity at, how often are you able to get things done, and what's your replenishment rate? Like how often should we be looking at adding stuff into here? Because I feel like that's just the slippery slope of just continually dumping more crap into this big list, that there's just a whole lot of negative stuff that comes out of that approach. And just that basic piece of information could be really powerful in deflecting some of that.
Well, backlog health is the bane of my existence right now. I have one client that's all Kanban, and we've been trying to figure out a good way to do this, right? Because it is a measure that they're looking at for each of the teams to say how healthy is the backlog. And it's taken us a lot of work, and I would love to hear your feedback on this because I made it up. But what we came up with
that's the best type.
What we came up with is kind of a combination of two things. We're looking, our target amount of work in the backlog, we said, is roughly equal to 4 weeks worth of throughput for each team. So the target changes based on the team's throughput. So we were trying to take into account what you're saying there of not over planning based on some generic number for the same, that's the same for every team. But the other thing we wanted to look at was the average age of items that are sitting in that queue. So maybe if this team gets 5 stories done every 2 weeks, we want at least 10 in their backlog, but we also want to see that they're leaving the backlog. And so that things, especially towards the bottom, right, that they're not aging out at the bottom because new things are always coming in at the top. So we agreed to look at both of those numbers side by side because it felt like one wasn't telling a complete picture without looking at the age.
Do you look at the SLE, like the 85 percentile for the stuff like in the backlog and the things on the bottom 15 that are just aging, like, what are we doing with these things? Are we throwing them out, or are we going to do them? Because you got to make some hard decisions probably at that point, or whatever.
Yeah, we didn't set an SLE for the backlog. The teams have delivery SLEs, but I like that idea. I mean, you could apply the same thinking there of saying nothing should age beyond this number in the backlog too. That's a great signal that you're probably never going to do it, or probably doesn't matter anymore, right? Or maybe that your backlog's too big.
Yep. There's just better opportunities, and more are going to come in that are better than this one right here. So why are we even managing it for 4 weeks if we know there's a better one? Like at a certain point, like we can start that number higher and we can edge it down probably over time. It almost seems like people are just so apprehensive to remove that stuff from a backlog. They're afraid they're going to run out of work or something. And it's like, that will never happen. There will always be opportunities to work on something.
Yeah, it's probably my favorite thing to just burn the whole backlog down. When somebody's talking about changing tools, I'm like, awesome. I can't wait to do that. Please don't import anything from your old tool into the new tool. It's such a cleaner start. But yeah, I think I tend to create like a pretty long funnel upstream for like team level work and story level work, so that there's a lot of places for the dumping ground, because you're right, it's hard. No one wants to not have that in their tool. So I create like a draft bucket, and then ready to groomed, ready for development. So I've got a good funnel of stages for everything, and a really clean way to see what's ready for the team to pull.
Yeah, and that Colleen, I love that idea of like levels of granularity. There's the bucket where I really don't give a damn. Like, right, just throw whatever you want in there. I'm going to devote little to no of my effort and time to managing that. But then when it gets closer to something that's reality, something more that I care about, we've defined business value, whatever that case may be, right? Like that type of workflow is fantastic. And I wish more product individuals had that versus just the dumping ground that you were talking about. Now, though, what I want to chime in with is, like, I hate with a burning passion roadmaps. Like, I think they are the biggest lie that we tell each other. Oh yeah, this is the thing that we're going to be working on 6 months from today, or God forbid, 2 years from today, blah, 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 blah. But what I'm trying to balance, especially at a company like Acorns, is we're in the process of going public. For our investors, we need to share out strategic vision. Like, where are we going to be as a company in 2 years, right? Like, what are some of the high level products and features? And I can talk about one of them now because it was announced not too long ago. But crypto, we want to bring crypto currency into our platform, right? And that is a whole shit ton of work, let me tell you. But nonetheless, like, that's got to wind up on a roadmap somewhere. And I think there's a big difference between a roadmap and a backlog. And that's where I feel like we have overloaded those two things, and we just call our backlog the roadmap. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. But to what you were just talking about, like the health of a backlog, when I think of backlog, I'm thinking about the things that are in the near short-term goals, initiatives, or items, that features, whatever we want to call that construct, like you were talking about. Like, that's the next month or two. Things that are outside of that, we either have a different construct to store them, or we use something like a roadmap. And there, I'm less concerned about the health. These are just cool, wild ass ideas that we could be going at. And I'm not necessarily concerned about any of these throughput metrics, because I'm not applying them to them. This is just my buffet of awesomeness that I could be going after with my product.
Can I come back for another hour? This is like one of my favorite topics too. No, I think you're spot on. I mean, one of the things I apply from a process perspective here a lot is like portfolio level Kanban, right? And when we think about that, we would apply all those same practices, right? We don't need a year's worth of epics in a portfolio backlog to, I don't care what we're going to be working on in 2023. It's probably, I'm going to be wrong the minute I publish that roadmap. So how do we look at all those things as options of possibilities that you could work on? And I think making those visible and making a really clear process for how do those options see the light of day is really important. But I think also making sure that you don't have one option for every art or one option for every team is also really important, because that's what I see a lot of organizations do. It's like, well, here's all the opportunities where, like, we defined our outcomes, we know what outcomes we're driving towards, and here's an opportunity for each team to deliver. Well, are we really vetting like multiple opportunities? If that's one-to-one, we should have a couple things, right? So when you are pushing something out, if it's not moving the needle, you can come back to the drawing board and say, we have 3 things we've vetted now that continue to drive towards this outcome. We could pick one of those 3 things to pull in next. And that's the other thing that I think is really busted about our roadmaps is there's only one next choice. There's only one next right thing to work on. And it's really binding. It's not just binding from a time perspective, it's binding from a choices perspective. And I think that hurts everything. That hurts innovation. That hurts your ability to respond to customers. So I also hate roadmaps. I'm with you.
I'm wondering if we could combine an idea here, and you tell me if this is horrible, because I'm thinking on the fly between what you two have just said. What if you had I love now, next, later roadmaps? So what if inside of your now that was more broken down, and you were doing, we were talking about WIP limits, you do some work on age, we have some SLE maybe, right, inside of there. And our next, maybe those are more just opportunities, and we don't even go farther than that. It's like, we're not even going to think about that. And when we say, here's our most important opportunities, we pick a set of them that replenishes our now when we, do so many, we get to such a range. And then, later is like, that's way out there. Like those things will replenish. But if we have some maybe WIP limits and ages even on those opportunities, and then the, later and in the next areas, maybe that just helps us to keep it clean and keep it sane, because there's always so many ideas. And what will be the most important thing to do in X number of months? You're right, Colleen. Like, you'll never know that. You'll never guess that. We know we're going to have something we're going to have to work on, and we don't know what new things are going to emerge. So we just have to keep our options open and not waste our time, I think.
Well, and then I think along those lines, too, of what you said of it breaking down from now, next, later is like, what is the criteria that we can all agree on that has to be true for it to move to next and to move to now? And that's something that a lot of organizations have a really hard time defining, right? It's like the highest paid person's opinion, or it's whatever we promised our customers next in a roadmap. And so I think getting really clear on how do we make sure we're still focused on that alignment back to like big strategic outcomes that you're trying to drive to, and then focused at a smaller level on learning. So how do you tie, like if something's in the now column, it should have a defined thing that you're going to measure that's going to help you know if you're delivering the right value towards that outcome. And like just make a learning objective, right? Write it like a course. Our learning objective for this epic is that we understand if our customers need more of XYZ, so we can pick that thing from the options. I think you can make that a really big feedback loop where what you're delivering from your now column is informing what's going back into the next column.
Yep. And I think that there should be some level of discovery in any kind of big thing that you're going to say, we're going to do this, right? Like we should do some validation and production with that. And so I think that could be another part of that, how that flows into that how does your intake and your filling of each queue, as you go through things. So yeah, I think maybe we're onto something. We gotta prove it out and show us to people. Maybe try it. Maybe Jeff can try it with one of his teams.
It's just interesting because even if I don't have that explicit workflow set up, that is definitely the way I think about things. But to what you two were just talking about, and this was shame on me really just for admitting it. Like I was really happy when going through some of the Kanban training that I went through was expanding that workflow to really be more holistic of your backlog, and not just what is the team working on, but what are those stages that lead up to the team being able to work on it. And there's, like we were just talking about, there's value in figuring out the metrics that are associated with all of those things, so you don't end up wasting your time holding on to things that are never going to get done. That being the case, I haven't yet put it in place, and I probably should. So shame on me.
We could connect you with a good Kanban coach. We could help you build out your portfolio upstream process.
Yeah, but I mean, all of that stuff is really good. And one of the other things that you had a hit on in there was your exit criteria. Like I love that concept, and I wish we could be more. I'm just like pontificating about my current situation here, but I would love if the team that I'm working with was more explicit about those things. We've got a very, what is the term, like lackadaisical?
Lackadaisical.
Let's just say lackadaisical. The other term was bullshit that I was going to come up with. Definition of done here, and that was another big light bulb moment for me when going through the Kanban training, which was your definition of done is really just accumulation of all of your exit criteria smushed together. And you know that anything that moves through your system has hit all of these exit criteria along the way. It's very explicit. Why not have that for refinement, right? Like if you're going to refine something and it's before it's even gotten into your work area of your workflow, like we have exit criteria that something has to meet before it moves in. To even get to the refinement stage, there's some basic exit criteria that has to exist inside of there. I just think that even that is such a powerful concept of transparency and alignment with your team around what to expect from each other, especially when you're starting to cross over roles. Like as the product manager, here's what you can rely on me for. When I bring this product backlog item to you to take a look at, it has a basic user story associated with it. The value proposition has been filled out. I've at least filled out some basic acceptance criteria to go along with it. I've put in enough to have a conversation with you. And if I wasn't here, that you would at least have a high level idea of what this thing was. And then refinement is to flesh it out a little bit more, et cetera. But I love that that agreement that it brings. Like, here's what you can expect from me, and this is what I can expect from you. And I think that's really liberating when it's defined in that way.
Yeah, and it helps a ton anytime you've got shared contributors too. So think of that whole workflow that you're just described of breaking work down and getting it ready for the team to consume. A lot of times one of the bottlenecks, I shouldn't say bottlenecks, one of the areas that's a shared contributor in that process is UX and UI. And so a lot of times if they're spread out across multiple different things that are in that funnel of getting broken down and ready for the team, having that very clear exit policy for each stage of your upstream process helps them see what is the most important for them to focus on first, what's done, and what next thing to work on when they're spread out across, maybe 5 or 6 teams of doing that. I think that's really helpful. I think the other thing you said though is, well, just in general, exit policies, I think, are the funniest conversation. Everyone assumes that that we're all on the same page about exit policies. And the minute everyone starts talking about them, it's always a shit show of like, well, that's not where we do the merge. That's not where you should put your code review. And I'm always like, how have we been functioning for this long without having this conversations? And same thing at like the portfolio level, right? Of where does design happen? Where does user testing happen? So I think that's a great thing to start to make really concrete, and then just like anything at the team level, refine it, right? So user testing is one where I see that get kind of jockeyed around in that process quite a bit. It's like, well, it goes here, and then all this stuff gets to the teams, and the teams start to develop it. And UX is like, that's we didn't get a chance to test this, or users haven't seen mock-ups yet, and so it's like that moves around a lot until you find the sweet spot in what stage of your workflow it's going to belong in, and that's a good thing. Like that trial and error of figuring out the right place for those activities to go is a good thing to play around with and to get locked down.
All right, Colleen. So in Prokanban, one of the things that I know differentiates us is diversity and inclusion, but a lot of people will say that, but like, how is Prokanban different than maybe other training organizations out there?
Yeah, I thought, again, like some of the other things I said today, I thought this would be easy, right? It's a new organization, and I felt like I knew a lot of people who looked different and who came from different backgrounds and had different perspectives who would be part of this journey. And what we found pretty quickly is if you let it happen organically, it doesn't happen at all. So we had to do something to make this, if that was our mission, to make this group of Kanban trainers and practitioners look like the clients and the audiences and the students we're serving. We had to get out there and make that a reality. So we built a scholarship program through Women in Agile and Lean in Agile, where we started connecting with Agile coaches all over the world and starting to work with them to say, if you or anyone is interested in going on this journey with us to become a Kanban trainer, we will sponsor you in that effort. We do mentoring sessions where each cohort, we've had 2 cohorts go through the program now, and each cohort gets mentored through the materials. We try to create a safe space for them to practice teaching with that cohort, so they get to practice on each other. And then we also spend some time talking about the business side of things, right? How do you set up an LLC? How do you price your courses? How do you write a statement of work? How do you price yourself in a way that this is worth your time, right? For a lot of people that are first venturing into training, it's they're doing it while they're still working full time. So it's like, how do you balance those things with an employer? And I have to tell you, it's probably been the most rewarding thing I've done in the last year. I've met so many amazing women all over the world. We have ladies that have gone through the program from Brazil, Nigeria, England, Scotland, I don't know, it's been amazing, and it's been really cool to work with them. And I feel like we've got this group that keeps coming back together to support each other and coach each other, which is like all I could have ever asked for, right? Is that there's a community now that wants to keep lifting each other up on that journey and then helping the next round to come through. So
awesome. Well, that's another great example of how Prokanban is just different. And I think if anybody meets the trainers, meets the people at Prokanban, you feel the difference. It's hard not to notice from my experience with Prokanban. So you're doing a great job. This has been a great community that I've been a part of, and I'm so happy you joined us, Colleen. I feel like we could have talked again for another hour or two, but we do have a hard stop. So with that, is there anything you want to plug to our users before we stop recording?
Well, I would definitely say check out Drunk Agile with Dan Vacanti and Pratik if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Kanban or whiskey. Check out prokanban.org for information about our classes and access to the Kanban guide. We will be adding more classes there over the next months, years to come. So that's the best place to go to get information on what's coming next. We do have a Slack community. That's a great place to join, and you can find that link at prokanban.org as well. And if you know anybody that might be an interested candidate for our next cohort of scholarships, you can send them either through Slack, you can contact me, or send an email to support@prokanban.org.
Thank you for listening to the Agile Wire. We are consistently inspecting and adapting ourselves. We would appreciate feedback at feedback@theagilewire.com or on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play Store. See you next time.